welcome to another adventure in Australian literature. Now, I'm going to guess you were expecting Janice this week. Janice is waiting for a book. It's not her fault. For once, it's actually not her fault. She ordered the book in December, and it's their fault at the beginning of December. So, yeah, it's not Janice's fault, and she doesn't want to double up 2 weeks in a row. So I'm doing this, and hopefully next week Janice's book will have come, and she'll be here next week. But in the meantime, I'm going to talk about 2 books. Yes, I'm going to talk about 2 books that are very instrumental in a very particular character within the Australian identity, the Larrikin. And those 2 books are Lewis Stone's book Jonah, which you probably have not heard of, even though it was immensely popular when it was published. And this one, which has a slip cover on it, which is, I'll take the slip cover off, the Sentimental Bloke by C.J. Dennis. So, these are the books about larrikins that we're going to have a look at. You have no doubt heard the term, but now we're going to dive into what it actually means. But before we start, remember, if you want to come and support us, there is our shop. We have books, we have writing services, we have 3 new books coming out this year, including the sequel to The Bonehead Resistance, which is going to be brilliant. Sequel to The Bonehead Resistance plus two new authors coming out this year. There's also our Redbubble shop where there's over 100 designs on there. Go check it out. Really helps us if you support us in that way. It also really helps if you like, if you share, if you subscribe, and if you comment. So all of those don't cost you anything. So we love hearing people's comments. Provided it's respectful, otherwise Her Infernal Majesty will deal with you. We warn you, we've warned you. But that's that. Now, I'm going to start with our books. So, the reason why I'm doing 2 books together is because this book couldn't exist without this book. This is one of the oldest books in terms of how far I go back with Australian literature, because I'm talking about Australian, not colonies. So really most of our Australian stuff is 20th century, because that's when we will look at some of a bit earlier. Would like to do some Henry Lawson, so that's a bit earlier, but really I don't go far back because there isn't really a huge amount. I'm not doing it for the time of his natural life. I'm just not. Sorry, it's just not happening. So this is one of the older books. This is from 1909 or 1911, I think. It's a Sydney book. It's an urban book. So we've moved from Convicts of our last book to back to the urban world, which actually is, ironically, for all our projected image of the bush, the majority of our population have always lived in the big metropolitan centres. That's where the majority of the Australian population has always lived, in the big urban centres. We are an urban people, and we like to be on the coast. We are not really bush as such in the way that people would think of it. It's like, out there in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. It's sort of an image we sell to tourists, but it's not really us. It's just that us isn't so picturesque. So this is a book about set in the slums of Sydney. The slums of Sydney are now very, very, very posh suburbs with very, very, very expensive houses. They don't exist anymore as slums. But these were the slums of Sydney. If you wondered where the convicts went, convicts who didn't, make a go of it afterwards, they stayed more or less close to where the old prisons had been in terms of in urban Sydney, and they became semi-skilled or unskilled labourers. And that's the world of Jonah. Jonah is a young man from the slums of Sydney. He is noted physically because he's a hunchback. And he is a member of a gang, or is actually the leader of the gang. And at this time, a gang was called a push. So he's a push leader. And these were gangs. They were gangs of young men. They were not the organised crime that you would see coming out of Sydney in the interwar period, the razor gangs, that sort of thing. That really, part of what kicked that off, that very particular form of criminal underworld, was a combination of drugs and alcohol. Because during the war you got prohibition and then you had sly grog. You always had sly grog, but prohibition, or we didn't have prohibition like America had, but the early closing, the 6 p.m. shutting, meant that there was a lot more illicit alcohol out there than had otherwise been. There was always illicit alcohol. But that really, much like in America where prohibition kicked off massive amounts of crime because, you ban it, people are still going to get it, closing the pubs early because at this point, pubs are open till about 11 o'clock at night. Normal, adult hours. But when they closed them at 6, you caused real problems. So this is a world that did quickly vanish. So he's a leader of a teenage young men gang. You're always going to have those. You're always going to have those. They fight with other gangs. They steal. They, gang activity. The other big thing that they have is what's called school, the 2-up school, the illegal betting. So this is a world of young men, of drinking, of betting, of fighting. Okay, so it's very much like any sort of young male world, and it's a very male world. There are women around, women, but women are not included in the gang. They're not part of a push. There are women who'll hang around, or girls who'll hang around the push, but they're not part of the push. Jonah has a child with a woman called Ada. She works in a factory, and when he meets his son, Ray, he marries Ada, leaves the push, and sets out on his own with a shoemaking shop. He one of the shopkeepers has died, and his widow is selling everything, and his mother-in-law gives him the money to be able to buy up the old shop with all the tools. And it turns out that this young man from very, very deprived background is really, really good at business. But he's also from this very, very particular sort of world. His wife, the prosperity that his business brings in, his wife is a drinker, and the more money there is, the more she can drink, and she's slowly drinking herself to death. Jonah meets another woman who is giving piano lessons to his son, and she is both repulsed by him and highly attracted to his money. So he falls in love with her. He absolutely falls in love with her. But while she is, while she's quite horrified by his look, and his rough manners, because she comes from more genteel poverty, whereas he comes from the slums. He's that sort of from that world. She does start to covet the idea of becoming Mrs. But it doesn't end the way that Clara wishes it to end. Even with the death of Ada. So it's a really interesting book. It's very much talks very much about class. It very much talks about this concept of an Australian that really is unique in some ways, but shares characteristics with a lot of the urban poor, though the fact that I think that that Jonah's ability to get ahead is seen as, especially for the early 20th century, seen as something that was a possibility in Australia, that hope, that strive, but also the fact that you get an understanding of very early how jumping class is really, really hard. Jumping class is hard to do when you are from the very bottom of society. To move up any rungs on that ladder is very, very difficult, so that no matter how much money Jonah has in his pocket, he never really fits in on any of those rungs further up. I think that Stone very deliberately made Jonah hunchbacked. I think there is a certain Richard III quality to the character in terms of the idea of usurping a place, in terms of what happens when you know, Jonah physically looks different, but everything about him is different from Clara and the world that she represents, that much more sophisticated, comfortable, middle-class world. Even though Clara has slipped down into the world of the slums, she still has the refinements and the cultural capital of her family's former position, and that allows her greater mobility than Jonah, who, while he has money, has zero cultural capital and isn't really able to understand how that is holding him back. Now, this one, and this is a reproduction of I think it's a 1916 edition, which is a special pocket edition for the trenches. This is the Sentimental Bloke, published in a small format pocket edition so that families could send this to their family members overseas in France and Egypt. Okay, so this was a absolute blockbuster. This thing sold like gangbusters. If you say the Sentimental Bloke, people know what you mean. There was a silent film made of the Sentimental Bloke in 1919. You can find it on YouTube. I will put a link down below. It is a complete silent film of the Sentimental Bloke. Of course, they didn't do what the illustrations of this one is. The illustrations of this are so adorable. They're little cupids. So I'll put a larger picture up next to it of what these images actually look like, but because I don't think you'll see it here. But they are, all of them, all the poems of the Sentimental Bloke are illustrated with these little bare-bottomed cupids. So the Sentimental Bloke tells the story of one Bill, also known as the Kid, who is, like Jonah, a member of a push. He likes to drink, he likes to gamble, he likes to fight. And then he meets Doreen. And Doreen, her job is sticking labels onto pots in a pickle factory. And he is absolutely besotted by Doreen. And the Sentimental Bloke tells the story of the courtship of the bloke, the Kid, and Doreen, and how they marry, how the Kid leaves behind the push, and how eventually they inherit her uncle's orchard in the country, and he becomes a settled family man with his wife, his son, and a little farm. And the whole thing is written in the vernacular of the Larrikin. So, to give you an idea of how this sounds, I do not have my glasses. This print is very small. So this is from a part one called The Siren. This is actually after Doreen and the bloke have had a fight and broken up for a little bit, but he hears her sing, and he has to take her back. So it's called The Siren. Or he has to beg her to take him back, because he was the one who was wrong, and he knows he was wrong, and he knows he screwed up. But this is the siren. This is what it sounds like. She sung a song, and I sat silent there, with both hands gripping hard onto me chair. Me heart was that yesterday I thought was broke, with humping such a heavy load of care, come swelling in me throat like I would choke. I felt hot blushes climbing to me air. Okay, it's written. The whole thing's written like that. Now, this book would not exist without Jonah, and C.J. Dennis actually admits as much. So this is the Larrikin tidied up. This is the Larrikin romanticised. This is what most people think of when they think of the Larrikin. What is different between this one and this one? This one is nastier, and there's fear. There is, people in this are petrified of no money, of literally starving. They are constantly in fear of people who are better than them. And that's what sets Jonah out apart from everyone else in his world, is he's going and meeting people straight on. There is no none of that false humility, because underneath the false humility, because of fear, because you're my boss, you can lay me off and I will starve because there isn't a dole, I have to work, or the landlord will throw me out, is this sneering contempt, because that's the only way you can maintain any dignity. So you have both this very two-faced quality that is coming out of fear, because when you put people into a position where they are forced into that fear, you will get that sneering contempt as the other side, as people attempt to retain some level of dignity over that, because people can't live groveling to that extent. It's also a world where to attempt that rise up out of gets pulled down, because who do you think you are? There is the contempt for learning, the contempt for those people who have learning, because they're, again, the better than, but also not the there is no culture of learning. So there is no way, although Jonah wants his son to be brought up differently, how can he understand what will happen? What happens when you do have a child who does get brought up differently, or who is capable of something different? Well, that's actually something that we see in a lot of Australian literature. In The Long Prospect, we see that. We see that in I for Isabella. A lot of the clever girls in Australian literature are coming from backgrounds where there is this sneering contempt for education, where education is only to find a job. And therefore, if you can't see a use for it, there's no point to it. Unfortunately, this is becoming a much more widespread view. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. So I think that the big difference is the fear. There is fear in Jonah that you feel through the characters. This one isn't got fear. Even with the, in Jonah they're afraid of the cops. Chook, who is Jonah's best friend in the push, he has his own narrative. And when the police raid the 2-up school, that's fear. That's big fear, because that's bad. That's, that's not just sort of, I might lose it. I might get arrested, then I will definitely lose my job, then I will definitely lose my, everything falls apart. So there is a lot of things that these people live in with fear. Sentimental Bloke comes from a person from a different class. Lewis Stone was a school teacher, and he had lived in this world, and he knew what it took to get out of this world. So it's not a surprise that he understands and doesn't really romanticize the world, the public drunkenness, the desperation for money, the willingness to do someone over in order to get ahead yourself, that sort of thing. The class loyalty. These are all things he saw and understood firsthand when he wrote the book. C.J. Dennis is not from this background. C.J. Dennis is taking these tropes, which are tropes in the Australian psyche already, and he is romanticising them and softening them down. This being sent to the trenches, it being made into a film, this is being read outside of the class that the Larrikin belongs to. So the concept of the Larrikin, the anti-authoritarian, the joker, the trickster, the, you know, have a bob each way type person, is being introduced to a class of people whom this isn't necessarily where they are. But this story made this incredibly popular, and it really took it on. We still see the Larrikin. The Larrikin is constantly in Australian things, but it's the Sentimental Bloke's Larrikin, not Jonah's Larrikin. Jonah's Larrikin is tough and dangerous and violent. This is the sanitized Larrikin. Most Larrikin, Jonah's world does not end with someone inheriting an orchard and living a bucolic life. This one does. This one marries the rough and tumble of the urban working class with the bucolic rural romanticism. If you want to see ideas of the Larrikin today, you can watch Barry Mackenzie is one. So that film, the Barry Mackenzie. You can look at The Castle. The Castle is absolutely the Larrikin. It is that world. I hate to say Paul Hogan because most people think Crocodile Dundee, and that's just garbage because that is ugh. And that is part of the problem, is the Larrikin is so easily reducible that it has been progressively slimmed down for export to be understood outside. And when people think about us, that's what they think about. The urban poor, as I said, where they lived at the early part of the century is now very wealthy suburbs. The urban poor now live in the outer suburbs. We don't call them Larrikins anymore, we call them Bogans. And chances are, if you're on TikTok or anything and you're seeing a lot of Australian content, the Australian content is most frequently from the Larrikin / Bogan perspective. It's not the only perspective we have in this country, but it is one that is very, very, very prominent. And you might have noticed I barely mentioned women in these stories. Yeah. That's actually why I needed to find things like Patrick White or a lot of our women writers. Because when you're given the Larrikin, there are a lot of people that are left out. I think that is one of the big problems of the Larrikin, is it leaves a lot of people out. It leaves the women out. It leaves out Indigenous people. It leaves out multicultural Australians. It is a white Anglo-Celtic idea. It is not one that is able to be massively inclusive. I think it's something that you can. I think now, today, people have pushed it a bit, but it is still very much this early template. So they're the two books. Jonah is the harder version, and this is definitely the romanticised version. Sentimental Bloke you can read very, very quickly. It's a collection of poems that were most of them were originally published in the Bulletin. He didn't just write this. There is also The Adventures of Ginger Mick. Ginger Mick is the kid's friend, and he goes to Gallipoli. He actually goes and fights because the bloke is a married man with kids. They weren't expected to do that, but Ginger Mick is a single man. He does what was expected and goes overseas to fight, and so his stories are very different to the Sentimental Bloke. But there you go. That's the larrikin in Australian literature. There are lots and lots of examples of the larrikin in Australian literature, some of them flattering, some of them not flattering. Blue in Riders of the Chariot is technically a larrikin, and he is a monster. So keep that in mind. There is a romanticized version, and then there is the truly, truly scary version. Both sides are correct. Both sides are plausible based on where this story comes from. So that's what we've got for this week, and I will see you again with another adventure in Australian literature. Bye-bye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.